The first, almost imperceptible sound was a faint muffled scratching, a tiny, desperate noise, so subtle it was nearly lost beneath the languid rustle of the vibrant bougainvillea leaves in the hot, still afternoon breeze. It was a sound that could have been an insect, a falling leaf, anything. But then it came again, accompanied by a soft, weak cry, a high-pitched mew, so distorted by its container, so thinned by terror, it barely registered as feline. Eleanor Carmichael. Marcus's elderly mother stood rigidly by the imposing sand-colored block of community mailboxes, her usually placid face etched with a growing frantic anxiety, her gaze darting with increasing desperation amongst the 16 identical sun-baked metal doors. "Leo, Leo, my darling, is that you?" She called out, her voice thin and trembling like autumn leaves, a stark contrast to the robust cheerfulness she usually projected. Marcus, a U.S. postal inspector on a rare weekday visit to check on his mother and enjoy a quiet lunch, felt a cold, heavy dread begin to coil in the pit of his stomach, a familiar precursor to the discovery of something deeply wrong. His mother's emotional support, Kat, a placid, affectionate ginger tabby named Leo, who was her constant shadow and furry confidant, had been inexplicably missing for over an hour. This was an unprecedented, alarming absence for an animal that rarely strayed more than a few feet from Eleanor's side, or the cool, tiled sanctuary of her small, shaded patio. Now, this faint, almost spectral sound. Marcus moved closer to the NBU, the Neighborhood Delivery Collection Box Unit, its official USPS designation, imprinted on a small, unassuming metal plate on its side. He pressed his ear against one of the hotter upper-tier boxes, the metal radiating stored solar heat, like a small oven. The scratching came again, more frantic this time, sharper, accompanied by another weak, plaintive cry that seemed to tear at his very soul. There was no mistake. Leo, his mother's gentle, beloved companion, was inside one of these federally protected mail receptacles, trapped entombed. A wave of stunned disbelief, quickly followed by a surge of ice-cold, razor-edged fury, washed over Marcus. Who in God's name would do something so gratuitously cruel, so wantonly malicious? And why? The unspoken question hung heavy and suffocating in the oppressive, sun-drenched silence of the Oak Haven Villas community, broken only by his mother's increasingly distressed, heartbroken murmurs and the terrifyingly faint, desperate sounds of her beloved cat being slowly baked alive. Eleanor Carmichael, at 78 years young, as she liked to say, was a woman of quiet, cherished routines and gentle, unassuming pleasures. Since the passing of Marcus's father 5 years prior after a long illness, her world had inevitably shrunk, its vibrant colors muted by grief and the encroaching limitations of age. But Leo, the handsome ginger cat with knowing amber eyes, whom she'd adopted from a local shelter on Marcus's gentle urging, had infused her life with a renewed warmth, a comforting rhythm, and a vital sense of purpose. Leo wasn't just a pet. He was a furry, purring lifeline, an officially recognized emotional support animal whose steady, calming presence helped mitigate the persistent anxiety and the sharp pangs of loneliness that sometimes threatened to overwhelm Eleanor, especially on days when her arthritis flared with a vengeance, or the cherished memories of her late husband David felt particularly poignant and raw. He'd follow her devotedly from room to room in her small sun-filled villa, a silent, devoted orange shadow curl up contentedly on her lap during her afternoon tea ritual, and his soft, rumbling purr was the comforting soundtrack to her quiet evenings spent reading or listening to classical music. Marcus, whose demanding and often perilous job as a postal inspector for the United States. Postal Inspection Service frequently took him away on complex, far-flung investigations, ranging from sophisticated mail theft rings and identity fraud operations to the illicit shipping of contraband and violent assaults on postal carriers, cherished these increasingly precious visits to his mother, a pocket of domestic calm and unconditional love in his otherwise turbulent and often grim professional life. He'd made sure she was comfortably settled in Oak Haven Villas, a sprawling, meticulously landscaped community that advertised itself as active, senior-friendly, hoping fervently it would provide a safe, supportive, and engaging environment for her later years. He knew every federal regulation governing the U.S. mail, every intricate statute pertaining to the sanctity, security, and inviolability of mail receptacles and their contents. The idea that someone would nefariously use one of these federally protected boxes, a symbol of communication and connection, as an instrument of heinous animal cruelty, was not just horrifyingly personal. It was a direct, contemptuous affront to the very laws he was sworn to uphold, a desecration of his professional domain. Carol Brewster, the self-appointed doyen and moral arbiter of the Oakhaven Villas. Homeowners Association, a woman whose perfectly lacquered nails, rigidly coiffed helmet of silver hair, and perpetually pursed lips seemed to broadcast a constant state of simmering disapproval and judgment, had made her unwelcome opinions about Eleanor, and by extension, Leo, known from almost the moment his mother moved in 3 short months ago. Carol, whose own villa was a monument to sterile showroom immaculability, seemed to view any deviation from her exacting and often arbitrary standards of order, propriety, and community aesthetics as a personal affront, a challenge to her self-perceived authority. Her initial comments about Leo had been cloaked in a thin, almost transparent veneer of feigned saccharine concern, usually delivered in a stage whisper to other residents during social gatherings, but clearly intended for Eleanor to overhear, a tactic designed to wound indirectly. "Well, such a shame, isn't it, my dears?" she'd remarked with a sigh at a community coffee, morning her gaze flicking pointedly towards Eleanor, who was gently stroking Leo as he sat calmly and regally on her lap, absorbing the affection. "When our elderly folks become so terribly dependent on animals, it's not entirely healthy, you know. They truly need to maintain their independence, stay actively engaged with people, not retreat into some sort of comforting feline fantasy world." The condescension had been palpable. The inciting incident, the precise moment Carol's passive-aggressive sniping and veiled criticisms had escalated into direct, unwelcome, and deeply upsetting interference, occurred about a month after Eleanor had finally settled all her belongings into her new home. Eleanor, a lover of warmth and gentle breezes, enjoyed sitting on her small, enclosed patio with Leo in the late afternoons, the cat often dozing peacefully on a cushioned wicker chair beside her while she read her mystery novels or tended her small collection of potted herbs. Carol, on one of her frequent neighborhood patrols, a self-appointed duty she undertook with the zeal of a minor potentate, had stopped abruptly and uninvited outside Eleanor's patio gate. "Eleanor, dear." Carol had called out, her voice dripping with a false, cloying sweetness that set Marcus's teeth on edge when his mother, clearly distressed, later recounted the incident to him over the phone. "That cat of yours, he really shouldn't be out here, you know, even on your own patio. What if he has fleas, or, heaven forbid, uses your lovely potted geraniums as a litter box? It's rather unsightly, isn't it? And, frankly, a potential hygiene concern for your immediate neighbors. Some of us, myself included, are highly allergic, you know." Eleanor, a naturally shy and conflict-averse woman, particularly since her husband's passing, had been flustered and apologetic. "Oh, but Leo is strictly an indoor cat, Carol," she had explained, her voice trembling slightly. "He never actually leaves the patio, and he's meticulously clean. He just so enjoys the fresh air and sunshine with me in the afternoons." "Be that as it may, Eleanor." Carol had persisted, her smile tightening unpleasantly her eyes like cold, polished stones. "Appearances matter a great deal in a premier community like Oakhaven. Visual harmony is paramount. Perhaps it would be best for all concerned if he were kept strictly indoors at all times. For everyone's comfort and peace of mind, you understand." She then added, with a pointed, almost pitying look at Leo, who had blinked slowly at her from his chair, "And honestly, Eleanor, at your advanced age, focusing your energies on human companionship, on engaging with your peers, would be far more stimulating and appropriate. Relying so very heavily on an animal, well, it's just a way of avoiding reality, isn't it? We simply must encourage independence in our seniors. It's for their own good, you see." That last remark, the patronizing, insidious, teach her independence theme that Carol seemed so disconcertingly fond of, had deeply upset Eleanor, making her feel small, foolish, and judged. It had ignited a protective, slow-burning fury in Marcus when he heard about it. He had paid Carol Brewster a courteous but unmistakably firm visit the very next day. He'd calmly identified himself not as a federal agent, but as Eleanor's concerned son, politely but unequivocally explaining that Leo was a well-cared-for, officially documented emotional support animal confined to his mother's private screened patio, and that her unsolicited demeaning comments about his mother's age, mental acuity, and companionship choices constituted harassment of an elderly resident. Carol had listened with an expression of perfectly feigned affronted innocence, denying any ill intent, claiming she was merely trying to be helpful. But her eyes, cold and calculating, had held a glint of something hard and unyielding that Marcus recognized instantly from his years of interrogating deceptive and manipulative suspects. He knew then, with a chilling certainty, that Carol Brewster was not just a meddling, opinionated busybody. She was a bully, a woman who preyed on perceived vulnerability, and she would likely not be deterred by a polite request or a reasoned argument. His protective instincts, both as a son and as a lawman, went on high alert. The rising action of Carol's insidious campaign against Eleanor and Leo was a steady, remorseless pressure, a series of calculated moves designed to isolate and undermine his mother. The first truly alarming incident demonstrating Carol's willingness to escalate her tactics occurred when she attempted to formally petition the Oak Haven Villas HOA board to ban all pets from private patios and lanais within the community. Her petition circulated with a self-righteous fervor, cited vague concerns about aesthetic uniformity, potential allergens spread into common airways, and unforeseen property value depreciation due to animal nuisances. It was filled with unsubstantiated, almost hysterical claims about animal odors, excessive shedding, and the psychological distress caused to sensitive residents by the constant sight of animals in close proximity. Bex. Marcus, acting on behalf of his mother, had attended the subsequent HOA meeting armed not only with Eleanor's official documentation for Leo as an emotional support animal, but also with meticulously prepared counter-arguments regarding fair housing regulations, the specific architectural design of the villas, which ensured patios were largely private and self-contained, and signed letters from several of Eleanor's immediate neighbors who attested to Leo's quiet, unobtrusive nature and their complete lack of any issue with his presence. He had systematically and calmly dismantled Carol's emotive but factually bankrupt arguments, pointing out the discriminatory nature of her proposal, its potential violation of federal and state disability accommodation laws, and the utter lack of any credible evidence to support her inflammatory claims. Mrs. Brewster's proposal. Marcus had stated calmly and clearly to the three-member board, his gaze steady, is not, as she claims, about community welfare or preserving property values. It is a transparently targeted attempt to harass an elderly resident and deprive her of a medically recognized and legally protected source of comfort and support. It is discriminatory, and should this board entertain such a prejudicial motion, you would be exposing the Homeowners Association to significant and entirely avoidable legal liability. The board members, clearly intimidated by Marcus's articulate, well-researched, and legally informed presentation, and perhaps by the subtle but unmistakable glint of someone accustomed to wielding authority in his eyes, had reluctantly, after a tense and uncomfortable debate, voted down Carol's petition. Carol had stormed out of the meeting room, her face a mask of thwarted, venomous rage, muttering audibly about bleeding hearts, the tyranny of special interests, and people who simply don't understand how to run a tight ship and maintain standards. Her public defeat, however, only seemed to harden her resolve to fuel her simmering resentment into a more dangerous, obsessive animosity. The second disturbing incident, which illustrated Carol's increasing boldness and cruelty, involved a direct act of intimidation against Eleanor when Marcus was unfortunately out of town on an urgent multi-day fraud case. Carol, seeing Eleanor alone tending the small community herb garden near the clubhouse, had cornered her, launching into a vicious, unprovoked tirade. According to Eleanor, who had been deeply shaken, but had with remarkable presence of mind managed to activate the audio recorder on her phone partway through the assault, Carol had accused her of letting herself go, of being a drain on community resources, and had stated that her unnatural and unhealthy obsession with Leo was making a pitiful spectacle of herself. Carol had allegedly told Eleanor, her voice laced with contempt, that dependent old people and their dirty, disease-ridden animals were dragging down the reputation and desirability of Oak Haven Villas, and that something definitive really needed to be done about it for the good of everyone else. Eleanor, though trembling and tearful by the end of the verbal onslaught, had captured enough of Carol's hateful words to provide clear evidence of the targeted harassment. The shaky, tearful recording filled with Carol's sharp, demeaning tones and Eleanor's frightened, whispered replies made Marcus's blood boil with a cold, controlled fury when he listened to it upon his immediate return. He had instantly filed a formal harassment complaint with the HOA management company against Carol Brewster, including the audio evidence and a detailed account of her previous actions. He had also discreetly consulted with local law enforcement about the options for obtaining a restraining order if Carol's behavior continued to escalate or crossed into physical threats. The HOA management company, after reviewing the evidence, had issued Carol a strongly worded written warning, instructing her to cease all unsolicited contact with Eleanor Carmichael. Carol had apparently laughed off the warning, telling another resident it was just a meaningless piece of paper from a bunch of ineffectual cowards who don't know how to manage things properly. Her arrogance was astounding, her belief in her own untouchability seemingly absolute and deeply ingrained. She clearly felt she was above any mere community censure. The midpoint twist, the discovery that added a chilling new dimension to Carol Brewster's increasingly unhinged behavior, and her apparent fixation on his mother and Leo came when Marcus, now deeply concerned for his mother's ongoing safety and psychological well-being, decided to do a more thorough, albeit discreet and ethically conducted background check on her. He utilized publicly available records and his network of contacts in local law enforcement in neighboring jurisdictions, not in his official capacity as a postal inspector investigating a federal crime, not yet, but as a worried son trying to understand the potential threat level of a relentless harasser. What he uncovered was a disturbing and illuminating pattern. Carol Brewster had a documented history in 2 previous communities, and even within Oak Haven Villas, before his mother had moved in, of latching onto perceived rule breakers, new residents, or individuals she deemed undesirable for one arbitrary reason or another, and waging relentless campaigns of petty harassment, anonymous complaints, and malicious gossip against them. There were records of numerous acrimonious disputes with neighbors, formal grievances filed by other residents citing her overbearing and intrusive behavior, her invasions of privacy, her attempts to micromanage their lives, and her vindictive rumor-mongering. Most disturbingly, he found a heavily redacted but still informative court record from a neighboring county indicating a previous accusation of animal neglect involving a small terrier she had briefly owned some years ago. The case had eventually been dismissed due to insufficient evidence, largely because the primary witness had moved away, but it had left a lingering cloud of suspicion and troubling questions about her capacity for cruelty or profound indifference to animal suffering. It seemed Carol Brewster wasn't just a stickler for rules or an overzealous HOA enthusiast. She was by all indications a serial harasser, a woman who likely derived a perverse sense of power and control from tormenting those she perceived as weaker, more vulnerable, or as simply defying her arbitrary and often nonsensical standards. And her oft-repeated comment about teaching Eleanor independence now sounded less like misguided patronizing concern and much more like a chillingly euphemistic threat, particularly given the troubling context of that past animal neglect accusation. Her relentless focus on Eleanor and Leo wasn't random or impulsive. It was a classic manifestation of her predatory pattern, a familiar script she was playing out once again with a new, unsuspecting target. Which brought them to this sweltering, unforgiving Saturday afternoon, the sun beating down relentlessly on the bank of identical metal mailboxes, and the horrifying dawning certainty that Leo, his mother's gentle, trusting companion, was trapped inside one of them, baking in the dark. "Mom, please try to stay calm," Marcus said again, his voice a low, steady anchor in the rising tide of her palpable panic, even as his own mind raced through a dozen worst-case scenarios: severe heat stroke, dehydration, suffocation, the sheer unadulterated terror the poor animal must be experiencing. He pulled out his federal credentials, his U.S. Postal Inspector badge gleaming dully in the harsh, unforgiving sunlight. "This is a federal offense, Mom, a serious one. Tampering with mail receptacles, willful obstruction of mail delivery, and egregious animal cruelty occurring on what is effectively federal property. She's crossed a line she can't even begin to comprehend." He already knew with a sickening, gut-wrenching certainty who she was. There was only one person in Oak Haven Villas capable of such calculated, heartless cruelty. He carefully examined the NBU. It was a standard USPS-approved cluster box unit, a formidable steel structure housing 16 individual locked compartments for residents' mail, with a larger outgoing mail slot and 2 parcel lockers. He could hear Leo's faint, desperate cries more clearly now, and a frantic, intermittent scratching from what he quickly pinpointed as Box 12A, an upper-tier compartment that would be absorbing the full brutal impact of the afternoon sun. His mother's mailbox was 7B on a lower, shadier tier. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate, malicious placement designed for maximum distress. "Stand well back, Mom," he said, his voice hardening with resolve. He inserted his USPS master key, the one that opened the entire front access panel of the MBU for mail carriers during delivery, rather than attempting to pick or force an individual resident's lock, which could compromise evidence. The heavy reinforced steel panel swung open with a reluctant groan of protesting metal hinges. And there, cowering in the very back of the dark, stiflingly hot and terrifyingly confined compartment, 12A, was Leo. His usually sleek ginger fur was matted with sweat and what looked like foamy saliva. His beautiful amber eyes were wide, dilated, and dull with terror and exhaustion, his breathing shallow, rapid, and labored. The small enclosed space reeked of fear urine and the metallic tang of superheated metal. He was clearly disoriented, severely distressed, and on the verge of collapse. "Oh, Leo, my poor, poor baby," Eleanor cried, lunging forward, her hands outstretched, but Marcus gently, yet firmly, held her back. "Careful, Mom. Easy does it. Let me. He's terrified and probably disoriented." Marcus reached in slowly, his voice, a low, soothing murmur, the same tone he used with frightened children or traumatized victims. "Hey there, buddy. It's okay now. We got you. You're safe." Leo flinched violently at first, then seeming to recognize Marcus's familiar scent or the gentle timbre of his voice, allowed himself to be carefully, tenderly lifted out. He was shockingly limp in Marcus's hands, his small body radiating an alarming amount of heat. He was dehydrated, trembling uncontrollably, and clearly in profound shock. As Marcus cradled the traumatized, whimpering cat, his sharp, assessing gaze swept the small, otherwise deserted cul-de-sac, and there she was. Carol Brewster, standing defiantly on her own, perfectly manicured lawn, a vision in crisp linen methodically watering her prize-winning, vibrant red roses with a garden hose, watching them with an unnervingly calm, almost detached and appraising expression. There was no surprise on her face, no flicker of concern, only a faint, chillingly satisfied smirk playing around the corners of her thin, disapproving lips. Marcus felt a surge of pure, undiluted rage, so potent, so visceral, it was almost a physical force, threatening to overwhelm his professional composure. But years of intensive law enforcement training, of dealing with criminals of every stripe, kicked in, overlaying the searing fury with a necessary layer of ice-cold professionalism. He handed Leo gently to his mother, who was now sobbing with a mixture of overwhelming relief and profound anguish, clutching the frail cat to her chest, as if he might dissolve into air. "Stay right here with him, Mom," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, deceptively calm. He walked across the sun-baked street, each step measured, deliberate, purposeful. Carol Brewster turned off her hose with a theatrical flourish as he approached her, expression shifting to one of feigned innocent inquiry, her head tilted at a questioning angle. "Why, Marcus, is everything quite all right? I heard some rather distressing commotion just now. Eleanor isn't having one of her little episodes, is she? One does worry at her age." "Barfs." Carol Brewster. Marcus began, his voice low and resonant, each syllable carrying the weight of his office. "You are, I presume, fully aware that this entire neighborhood delivery collection box unit serial number 487B USPS is the property of the United States Postal Service, and that tampering with it, defacing it, or placing any unauthorized items, articles, or creatures within it is a serious federal crime." Carol's smirk faltered almost imperceptibly. "Well, I certainly wouldn't dream of tampering with official federal property, Marcus. Goodness me, no. I'm a thoroughly law-abiding citizen, as you well know. I pride myself on it." "Torati. Then perhaps you can enlighten me." Marcus continued, his eyes like chips of granite, unwavering, pinning her in their gaze, as to how my mother's emotional support cat Leo came to be locked inside Mailbox 12A, a box I might add not assigned to my mother and for which she has no key, suffering from severe heat distress, dehydration, and abject terror. Carol actually tittered a high, nervous bird-like sound that grated on Marcus's already frayed nerves. Oh, that silly, naughty cat. He must have simply crawled in there himself when the mail carrier left the panel open for a moment. You know how incredibly curious those creatures are, always getting themselves into mischief, aren't they? The mail carrier for this particular route, Mrs. Brewster, Marcus said, his voice dropping another degree, becoming even quieter, yet somehow more menacing, is named Ms. Henderson. She is a 22-year veteran of the Postal Service with an impeccable record. She secures this NBU panel with a master lock after every single delivery without fail. No individual boxes are ever left open or unattended. Furthermore, Leo is an elderly, somewhat arthritic cat, utterly incapable of jumping into a mailbox, situated nearly 3 feet off the ground from a standing start, and then somehow pulling the heavy spring-loaded door shut, securely behind him. He paused, letting his words hang heavy and damning in the hot, still unforgiving air. But you were seen loitering near the mailboxes approximately 1 hour ago, weren't you, Carol? Around the precise time Leo went missing from my mother's patio. He was bluffing slightly about her being definitively seen placing Leo in the box, but he knew her obsessive routines, her compulsive need to monitor the neighborhood's comings and goings. It was a calculated risk, designed to break her composure. Carol's carefully constructed composure finally catastrophically cracked. A mottled, unbecoming flush rose on her neck, spreading up to her cheeks. Well, even if perhaps I gently encouraged him in there, it was entirely for Eleanor's own good. I've told you before, Marcus. She's far too dependent on that wretched animal. It's not natural. I was just trying to teach her a little bit of independence, to show her that she can cope perfectly well without it constantly underfoot, demanding her attention. It was a kindness, really. A form of tough love, if you will. The breathtaking callousness, the sheer unadulterated arrogance of her admission, the grotesque perversion of the word kindness, solidified the ice in Marcus's veins. Teaching her independence by committing aggravated animal cruelty and multiple federal felonies, Carol... He reached slowly into his jacket pocket and produced his leather credentials case, flipping it open to reveal his gleaming badge and official identification. Carol Brewster, I am a United States Postal Inspector, a sworn federal law enforcement officer. You are hereby under arrest for violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 1705, willful damage to mail receptacles or mail matter, Section 1708, theft or obstruction of mail matter. Generally, in this specific instance, rendering a mail receptacle unusable for its intended purpose by placing a live animal within it and thereby potentially contaminating or obstructing deliverable mail, and pending a thorough veterinary examination of the animal, you will also face state charges of aggravated animal cruelty. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you by the court. Carol Brewster's face, as the full devastating weight of his carefully enunciated words and the undeniable reality of the gleaming federal badge finally sank through her layers of self-delusion and entitlement, transformed with shocking speed from smug, defiant superiority to a mask of stunned, sputtering disbelief, then dawning abject and utterly pathetic terror. The Oakhaven Villas' self-appointed queen bee the neighborhood tyrant was about to discover the full, unyielding, and often surprising reach of federal law. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of controlled professional action on Marcus's part, a stark contrast to the tearful, anxious concern radiating from Eleanor. While waiting for local police backup, whom he'd requested for prisoner transport, and to handle the initial processing of any potential state-level animal cruelty charges, though the federal charges related to the mail receptacle would clearly take precedence, Marcus had Eleanor rush a still-trembling Leo to the nearest emergency veterinary clinic. He meticulously documented the scene at the NBU, photographing the interior of Mailbox 12A, noting the extreme ambient heat within the sun-baked metal box, the lack of ventilation, and securing preliminary statements from 2 neighbors who, it turned out, had indeed seen Carol Brewster loitering with intent near the mailboxes, shortly before Leo had gone missing, though they hadn't directly witnessed her placing the cat inside. Their testimony, however, would significantly corroborate the timeline and Carol's opportunity. Carol Brewster, stripped of her arrogant composure and now resembling a deflated, bewildered parade float, was a blubbering, protesting mess, as she was formally handcuffed by the arriving local police officers under Marcus's watchful and unyielding eye. Her indignant cries of, "It's all a dreadful misunderstanding," and "I was only trying to be helpful to encourage independence," and "You can't do this to me, I'm an important member of this community," fell on entirely deaf ears. The full formidable weight of the United States Postal Inspection Service, a federal law enforcement agency whose quiet efficiency and broad powers many people were largely unaware of, was about to descend upon her with a vengeance. Leo, thankfully, though severely dehydrated and suffering from acute heat exhaustion and extreme stress, was found by the attending veterinarian to have no permanent internal injuries. After a night on intravenous fluids, careful monitoring, and a great deal of gentle reassurance, he was expected to make a full physical recovery, albeit with some understandable lingering trauma from his terrifying oven-like ordeal. The veterinarian's detailed report on his condition, outlining the clear evidence of suffering and endangerment, would become a crucial piece of evidence for the animal cruelty charge. The legal proceedings against Carol Brewster were intricate and multifaceted, involving both federal and state jurisdictions, but the federal charges related to the willful misuse and obstruction of a U.S. mail receptacle took undeniable precedence. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the district, briefed thoroughly by Marcus and his superiors at the USPIS regional headquarters, took the case with the utmost seriousness. Interference with the U.S. mail, especially when combined with such blatant, calculated cruelty and the deliberate targeting of a vulnerable elderly individual, was not something they treated lightly or dismissed as a mere neighborhood squabble. Carol Brewster's high-priced defense attorney attempted to portray her as a misguided eccentric, but ultimately harmless busybody, whose actions, while perhaps ill-judged and regrettable, were not intended to be malicious or criminal. He argued for leniency based on her age and her supposed long-standing contributions to community life. But the carefully presented evidence of her escalating campaign of harassment against Eleanor, her documented history of similar petty tyranny in other contexts, Marcus's own clear and compelling testimony, and the sheer undeniable cruelty of deliberately locking a helpless animal in a sun-baked metal box to suffer painted a very different, far darker picture. The teaching her independence defense crumbled under the weight of its own absurdity, and callousness during cross-examination revealed as nothing more than a pathetic and self-serving justification for a cruel, vindictive, and illegal act. Ultimately, after a tense trial that garnered considerable local media attention, Carol Brewster was found guilty on multiple federal counts, including willfully obstructing a mail receptacle and creating a hazardous condition affecting items deposited for collection by the U.S. Postal Service. She also pleaded no contest to the state charges of misdemeanor animal cruelty to avoid a more prolonged and potentially damaging separate trial on that front. Her sentence, delivered by a stern federal judge who excoriated her behavior from the bench, included a significant period of federal probation, sparing her immediate incarceration, due primarily to her advanced age and lack of prior felony convictions, but with extremely stringent conditions including house arrest for the first 6 months, substantial court-ordered fines, mandatory intensive psychological evaluation, and ongoing anger management therapy. A lifetime ban on owning or residing with any animals, and crucially for Eleanor's peace of mind, a permanent ironclad restraining order prohibiting her from any form of contact whatsoever with Eleanor Carmichael or Marcus Ramirez. She was also ordered to pay full restitution for Leo's extensive veterinary bills and for the cost of replacing the specific mailbox lock she had likely damaged. Her reign of petty terror was well and truly over. Her reputation in Oakhaven Villas and beyond was in irreparable tatters. The Oakhaven Villas HOA, profoundly embarrassed by the incident, the subsequent negative publicity, and facing the very real threat of a civil lawsuit for failing to adequately address Carol's long-standing pattern of harassment, despite previous, albeit less formal complaints from other residents over the years, underwent a significant and much-needed shakeup. The existing board members resigned en masse, and a new, more responsive board was elected by the residents. One of their first acts was to institute stricter codes of conduct for all residents, a clear, transparent, and robust policy for addressing and investigating resident harassment complaints and to arrange for mandatory training sessions on disability awareness, elder sensitivity, and conflict resolution for the entire community. Carol Brewster's villa was quietly put up for sale a few months later. Eleanor, though deeply shaken by the ordeal and the betrayal of a neighbor, found a renewed sense of security and peace in her home, knowing that her son's professional role had in a profoundly personal and direct way protected her and her beloved Leo from further harm. Leo, after a period of being understandably wary of any enclosed spaces and particularly distrustful of the community mailboxes, Eleanor arranged to have her mail held at the local post office for a time, gradually returned to his placid, affectionate self, rarely straying far from Eleanor's comforting presence. His purr once again, a steady, reassuring rhythm in her life. The wider Oak Haven Villas community, awakened from its comfortable complacency by the shock of Carol's crime, became a more vigilant, more aware, and ultimately a more compassionate and supportive place. Neighbors who had once been hesitant to speak up or get involved reached out to Eleanor with genuine warmth, apologies for their past silence, and offers of friendship and support, their collective shame over Carol's actions, translating into a quiet determination to foster a more caring and respectful environment for everyone. Marcus, watching his mother months later contentedly reading in her sun-dappled patio garden with Leo purring peacefully and securely on her lap, felt a quiet, profound sense of satisfaction. The case had been a deeply uncomfortable, emotionally draining collision of his personal and professional lives, but it had also been a stark, powerful reminder of why he did what he did every day. Upholding the law, protecting the vulnerable, ensuring the integrity of systems that society relied upon for connection and commerce. These were not abstract ideals, but tangible, vital actions that had in this instance brought safety, justice, and a measure of peace directly to his own beloved family. The quiet hum of the Oak Haven Villas neighborhood, once underscored by an undercurrent of petty tyranny and fear, now felt genuinely peaceful, a testament to the fact that even the most insidious forms of cruelty and abuse of power could be confronted and overcome sometimes from the most unexpected and uniquely authorized quarters of federal law enforcement.